Hey there everybody, Decaf here from YSFlight headquarters, and today I'm bringing to you a tutorial about making panel lines. Now, in the last year and a half or so, I've gotten a lot of experience as I've been working on HQPGAC models, and with these models, panel lines really bring out a much higher quality add-on at the end, even with a very low face count. Now, today I'm going to show you basically three techniques. One is pretty quick and dirty, but first let's talk to you about how I like to make my panel lines. Now, as you can see here, I've already got some put up on this Mitsubishi T2 model, and I've been mirroring it across the other side. Mirroring is very, very useful when making all these panel lines. Now, once I make the geometry for the panel lines, the next thing I'm going to do is determine what transparency I'm going to add. I always set the face color to black, pitch black, but for the face modes, or the transparencies rather, there's two transparencies that I like to use. Now, for anything that is going to be part of a control surface, so this right here is the rudder, I'm going to set the transparency to 180. And then for everything else, I'm going to set the transparency to 220. And what this does is it gives the effect of really highlighting that control surface, which generally stands out more than all of the other panel lines that you will see on a model. Now, in HQPGAC, I'm using this for flight control surfaces and landing gear doors. And then all other panel lines are going at the lighter 220 transparency level. Now, in terms of widths and things like that, I am making all of these panel lines 2 centimeters wide. And that strikes a pretty close balance between being able to see them and getting appreciation for them, and not being so big that you can't make small details. So let's talk about some techniques to make panel lines. Probably the easiest, and I'm just going to create some very rough panel lines here, is to add in a face or a plane and then scale it so that it comes down to being 0.02 meters in one of the dimensions. And then I'll usually scale this up a little bit in one direction so that I have a nice long panel line. And then I can move them around as I need. And I'm just going to create a sample outline here. And it's something that kind of approximates what you might see on the bottom surface for some flaps or something like that. Now, this is fairly straightforward, and for very basic shapes, this actually works very, very well. And so what I'll do is I will merge all of these together into a single mesh, and then I need to start trimming things down. All right, these are pretty ginormous, so we're going to just crop a little bit outside of where we need to be, just so that we can have some vertices to use as cut reference points. So I'm going to get rid of all these guys that are really far away, and now we're just dealing with these vertices here in the middle. And what I'd like to do is to have a nice clean interaction here. So let's just zoom in up here. So up in this top right corner, that's where I want the outer corner of my final panel line mesh to be. And this bottom left corner is where I want the other corner of the mesh to be. Well, I can make some cuts across here and coming down diagonally, and that'll start to get us to the geometry that we need. So let's just go straight across there and straight across here. And now we can come back and we can try deleting these. Oops, that deletes everything. So what we can do instead is just merge these faces back in, delete there, and that's looking pretty good. Now, For HQPGAC, we're all about minimizing face count. And so what I like to do is just clean these up just a little bit more. So it was 3 faces, is now 2 faces. It's not a huge change, but it does add up over a while. And we'll do the same thing down here. We can get rid of these guys. We'll merge these back. And there we go, we've got most of it done. Last thing to do is just do a quick little trim down here. And I'm going to cheat a little bit. I'm just going to slide these over. And there we go. We have our panel line mesh made. Now let's go ahead and paint it black. We will then go ahead and set this to 180 faces, because I'm kind of outlining, 180 transparency level. And then the last thing we need to do is to shrink wrap this over the mesh of the fuselage and the wing. So we'll do a quick shrink wrap, and we'll get the name of this object. In this case, it's quadruple 0. And paste it in there. I like to use a 1 centimeter offset using the projection shrink wrap type for all of these sorts of things. Then we're going to go into the Z negative direction, and you see that we've got a little bit of cut through, and that's because we haven't accounted for the underlying mesh of the wing with our shrink wrap. So if we go into wireframe view, we can see that we've got one edge going all the way through. So we're going to make that cut here. And we don't have to be super precise, but the closer that we get, the better. And now when we come back out, we see the entire mesh. And we've got a little bit of a hard edge right here and here. So we'll just set this entire thing to smooth. Now that is a fairly straightforward control surface outline panel line that I'm making here. But there's also some other times where you're going to have really complex geometries that you're dealing with. And so in that situation, what I like to do is, or I'm going to add in a new face here just as a quick example. And let's say we're trying to make something that's got some really complicated geometry, maybe something for a landing gear bay. And this is really zoomed out, or sorry, made big here, zoomed in on it, just so that I can kind of highlight this complicated geometry, where if you were to try to position and kind of trace out a face, how we did it for this guy, it would get pretty tedious very, very quickly. So what I like to do here is I make a geometry, and here I will then extrude it by pressing E, and I'll extrude the entire region up a little bit. Now, one thing that you might find is that all the normals are facing inwards, and that can be a little bit of a challenge for this, so I like to just do Control N to recalculate the normals going outside so that it'll make the next steps easier. Now, what we're going to do here is I'm going to go into the hiding the background geometry and go into face mode, and I'm going to extrude out every face by 0.02, i.e. 2 centimeters. And this can take a little bit, but it generates these things a little bit faster than you might otherwise be able to do with the other technique that I showed you. And making the normals all in the same direction, i.e. pointing outwards, means that you don't have to deal with positive or negative extrude distances. It's all going to be the same 0.02. Now we're going to go ahead and delete these top faces and vertices there, and we're going to delete the interior faces there. So we're just left with our outline for our panel lines here. Now you notice that we've got to make up some distance here. And if I were to just simply merge at center, well, now we've got a really skewed panel line here. It's not very consistent, not very neat. So what I like to do is just select the edge of every single one of these and scale it out a bit so that I'm exceeding the projection from all of the other edges that it shares a side with, essentially. And for this, it's usually easier to just use the median point pivot rather than the cursor, because then you can save some extra steps. You don't have to snap the cursor to your selection every time. Now here on the corner here, this can be a little bit of a challenge. So this is where I'm actually going to go in with a 3D cursor and just snug this in a little bit so that we don't have to deal with cutting across multiple sides. We're just going to cut on this inside. And where I can, I will avoid trying to make extra work for myself if I don't have to do that. So for example, up here, I was scaling away from this point because I already have an overlap between the two faces on this inside edge. And over here, I just need to scale out. Now for this one, since it is kind of close up there, we're just going to go to the middle and scale from there. And what you should have here is a whole bunch of edges ready to start cutting. And we're going to go ahead and use the exact cut and basically just kind of trace along the edges. And we're going to do this all the way around. And we're basically cutting edges and putting vertices where we want them. So you can see here, there was a couple extra vertices that got created, but we had a vertex here at the corner where we're going to want our final mesh to be. And that's going to be important for later. I usually like to do all of this at the same time just because that works for me. But if you wanted to do the final mesh cleanup as you cut through, that totally works. So let's get on to that mesh cleanup. So for this one, oops, we're going to need to make a final cut to add in that vertex. And we're basically going to just always merge on the last vertex selected or the first, depending on how you do this. But I usually just like to do a little loop select on these guys where there's just a lot. And then just reselect the last vertex that I want everything to merge to. Oops. And you can see here when you can make a mistake really easily. See, I didn't undo this last selection. So always just make sure to toggle off your selection before you move on to the next corner. And we're almost done here. And looks like we have now got all the vertices cleaned up. But we still have a bunch of faces that are triangulated. So we're going to get rid of them by converting all of the triangles to quads. And now we've got our faces. Now one downside of using the method I showed you is it will kind of flip the normals upside down on you. But we can flip them back upright and then go through the same shrink wrap and processing from there. Now the last method is when we're coming in and working on some details. So here we might have some little access panels that are chopped out. Now, sometimes those access panels are, quite circular or square, or maybe they're a little oval. But here, I'm just going to assume that we've got a circle, that access panel. And while I could use the same method that I just showed you, that would get very, very, very repetitive very, very quickly. So what I'm going to do here, just to simplify things a little bit for myself, is I'm going to rotate this 22.5 degrees. So I have an edge parallel to the global axis. And what I'm going to do is extrude out a single vertex out my panel line width, which is 2 centimeters. And then I'll select all of the interior vertices, extrude only edges. Now I've got this. Well, I'm going to press escape And what that does is basically just snaps all the vertices right where they were before, and now they're kind of duplicated and they're on top of each other. And then I'm going to scale until I see my width here just about on top of the vertex over here. And again, this isn't going to be super precise, but it gets it quick and dirty. And I'll just delete that little vertex, extrude it out. There's my little oval, or you can keep this as a circle. It's up to you. Now, one thing that you'll see with all of the models is if you have a lot of little access panels and you're just throwing all the detail into your panel lines, sometimes it can get kind of cluttered. And what I'd recommend you do is mix it up a little bit. You know, sometimes you can have an axis panel that is going to be, you'll map out the outline to it. And sometimes you just make the entire axis panel, especially smaller ones, this works well for, a single face. And this works pretty well. Let me show you an example. So here is the SU-24 HQPGAC blank model. And this has a mix of panel lines where I've got the outlines and the solid fills. Now, if you were to replace every single solid fill with another outline style panel line, it would get a little bit repetitive, and it would not look as good as it could be if you mixed in other options. Now, this is probably a lot more panel lines than I'm used to putting in, but it really helps snap the model up. And for a fairly low vertex and face budget, here the center is about 1,500, and then I think all the others add up to another about 500 faces. So for about 2,000 faces, you add a ton of quality to a fairly low polygon model. And the underlying mesh is 200 faces. It's not that much. So you can take a relatively low detail model, add in panel lines, and boom, you can have quite a lot of detail for relatively low face and vertex counts. Now, what kinds of things should you be looking at in order to determine where to put these panel lines? Well, there's a lot of reference images that you can use, but one of the things that I found works best is to just get a simple 3 view. And as you can see in this image, there are quite a few options that you can go and pick. This one's relatively low detail. This is also a Mitsubishi F1, which is a cousin of the Mitsubishi T2 that I'm working on. And you can see that there are a lot of panel line outlines here that you can take advantage of to make your panel lines. And you could almost trace out on your model where these panel lines go. So I hope this video was useful, and if you have any questions, you can throw them in the comments below.